Hello and welcome to Think Ahead, a podcast from London Business School where we discuss cutting-edge research, real-world insights, and expert analysis to address the most pressing challenges facing businesses and their leaders today. I'm your host, Sergei Guriev, Professor of Economics and Dean at London Business School. I'm particularly excited about today's topic, not only because we are joined by two distinguished guests, whom I will introduce shortly, but because we'll be discussing what it takes to master the art of ethical leadership, an area that is central to one of the 6 global challenges that we are addressing as part of London Business School's 60th anniversary celebrations this year. To help us explore these important questions, I'm joined by two exceptional guests, Elinor Flynn, Assistant Professor of Organisational Behaviour here at London Business School, who just joined us this year, and Oliver Morley, who is our alumnus and Chief Executive Officer of the Money and Pensions Service. Oliver was awarded CBE for his contribution to digital public services and has had a distinguished career in both public and private sector. Elinor and Oliver, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So I would like to talk about the basics first. What are the core principles of what we define as ethical leadership? And what does research reveal on impact of ethical leadership on employee morale and organizational success? How can leaders actively foster ethical leadership in those teams, in their own organizations? And what can help them to build trust with internal and external stakeholders? Let's start with you, Elinor.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of how we define ethical leadership tends to be, has been investigated by kind of core principles, including demonstrating integrity. So being seen as a leader who upholds honesty and other moral principles in their words and actions. Secondly is accountability. So in addition to being seen as someone who's honest and ethical, are there actual systems in place, and does the leader hold themselves and others to being responsible for their decisions and decisions of others, and taking responsibility when failures to behave ethically or responsibly occur? Third, I would add is inclusivity. So is this someone who is seen as being open to a broad range of perspectives and ensuring that there's fairness in how people are treated and how decisions are made? And fourth, also is encouraging moral behavior in others. So not merely how the leader acts themselves, but also is seen to kind of to foster a culture or incentives in which other employees feel emboldened to report unethical conduct and also want to hold themselves to a similarly high ethical standard. And in terms of what we know about from research about what are the effects of ethical leaders on their organizations and teams, so most of the studies that look at this will go into an organization and they'll want to evaluate both employees who all report to the same leader. So we want to have multiple evaluations of the same leader, and they will be asked to report how ethical and to what extent the leader or manager that they have adheres to these types of principles. And then at the same time, we have information from the leader themselves on their perception of how much unethical behavior happens within the organization, for example, or the performance of their employees, et cetera. And so we can kind of match how do employee perceptions of the leader predict what the leader says about different outcomes in their team or the organization. And a couple of themes have emerged from this. One is that somewhat intuitively, leaders that are more ethical tend to also have teams and organizational cultures where there's less unethical behavior in the team or the group. And also employees tend to behave more pro-socially towards others. So they are more likely to help their colleagues. They're more likely to go out of their way above and beyond what is explicitly required from just their job description to stay late, help a colleague out with something they're working on, etc. So they tend to kind of foster climates and cultures that in which the role modeling of the leaders seems to have an effect on the behavior and positive ways of employees. Somewhat less intuitively, but I think equally importantly, is that we're increasingly seeing that ethical leaders actually have employees and organizations that perform better relative to their peers, and also employees that are more committed to the organization itself. And the idea here is that ethical leaders tend to have more high quality interactions with their employees. They foster open communication, which increases trust, and these leaders tend to be liked more. As a result, employees feel more motivated and engaged. They're more likely to ask questions, seek help, therefore their learning's more effective, and then ultimately they perform better and feel more loyal to the organization.
If we talk about the magnitudes of those effects, of course, these depend on the context, on the size and mission of the organization. But are these effects quantitatively important? To what extent a very ethical leader outperforms a reasonably unethical leader by a huge margin?
Yeah, they are. So we know that both within small teams, there are statistically significant differences, which might account for performance or productivity differences around. In behavioral research, we consider a large effect something like 20 to 30% differences. So that's kind of the ballpark that we're looking at here. And there's also evidence that this translates at a higher level to the organization's performance as a whole relative to other peers in their industry in terms of profits generated or revenues generated as well.
Thank you, Elinor. Turning to you, Oliver, what would ethical leadership mean to you? And in your experience in public and private sector organizations, have you seen those leaders who've behaved more or less ethically, and whether it had implications for their organizational success?
So from my point of view, I've been about half and half particularly since I left LBS, between private and public sector. And I've been lucky enough to work for businesses which have had a really clear purpose, either in the public or private sector. So, for example, I was at Reuters. And the Reuters principles were very clearly and effectively communicated to the whole organization. People really understood what that meant. It didn't, however, necessarily mean there was stellar economic performance. And that's because, while it is obviously a really, really important part of an overarching purpose for an organization, clearly there are other significant market factors that can overwhelm everything, really. But from my point of view, as a leader now, someone asked me why I do what I do. And I've run various bits of the public sector, which I think, for the most part, people would, and I don't want to be immodest, but they've been successful. So, we've abolished the tax disc, launched lots of things that have been really, really successful. And I think that's because we focus on effectively making good things with good people, trying to ensure that the product, the service that we deliver is done in a way that really thinks about wider stakeholders, but thinks in the round, as opposed to specifically thinking about a group of customers or a group of shareholders or whatever. We have to, the reality of being in a part of government is you have to have a more encompassing view of stakeholders, which, if done badly, means you effectively are mired in bureaucracy and risk avoidance. But if you do it well, does mean that people think really in terms of what is it that I can do well for everyone, as opposed to just themselves.
You're mentioning the pro-social behavior that Elinor also referred to, and external factors. And I think the researchers usually try to separate the external environmental factors from the internal pro-social contributions to the organization's purpose. One of the issues that Elinor mentions, which resonates with me as a CEO myself, is communication. So when you have confidence in ethical leadership, did you observe that people are more likely to share ideas, to talk to each other, to engage in a win-win mindset? Is that something that's been your experience as well?
Yes, I mean, having the clarity as to where you stand with the organization and understanding that certain behaviors are preferred and that people actually get success by making sure their colleagues are involved and not working in silos, that kind of thing, because we have an overarching goal. I think that really helps people understand how best to get results in a way that just doesn't damage, even if that's your low bar. Beyond that, you can be incredibly productive. And I think, one of the things about the public sector is that people aren't paid as much, whatever people might think in terms of pensions, particularly in the UK. But they are prepared under the right circumstances to really go for it in terms of making sure things happen in the right way. I see that all the time. So that commitment, that extra effort that people are putting in, that pro-social side of things, I think comes from having that clarity of purpose. And if you can make sure the right environment is in place and the tools are there to support them, they can do amazing things.
Yes, I agree. Elinor and myself, we work in a university, which is a third sector charitable organization. For us, clarity of purpose is really what drives people and makes us come to work every morning. I suggest we talk about real world examples of ethical or unethical leadership, and where we would see successes driven by ethical leadership or potentially failures which emerged because of lack of ethical leadership. Any real-world examples which are well studied and understood, Elinor?
Yeah, so I think, unfortunately, there's several examples that we can learn from for analyzing as case studies, lapses in ethical leadership. And I think in general, when we see these, they're often failures around at least two core failures. One is a lack of systems in place to ensure that incentives are aligned around ethical leadership. So everyone likes to think of themselves in general as an ethical person. Leaders in general, I think if you ask them to report how ethical they are, they would all self-report pretty highly. So the problem is there are often mixed incentives that lead leaders or organizations to actually act in ways that go against their stated values. There's a trade-off around that I think can lead to these ethical failures is around short versus long-term thinking. So I can think of two recent examples of kind of corporate scandals that I think illustrate this. One here in the UK, can think of the post office scandal that went on for decades, starting in the 90s, and is still, the consequences of which are still being understood. So very briefly, I'm sure many listeners are familiar with this, but
we have a global audience, so some people have not read British newspapers.
Yes. So essentially, the UK Post Office was found convicting hundreds of their employees for stealing money from the post office for decades. So these are people that were accused of stealing and went to prison, lost their jobs, had really, really serious consequences. It turns out that, in fact, what was going on is there was a faulty accounting system. Horizon was the company whose software was being used to kind of manage the accounting. And turns out there were errors and faults in the system itself. So employees raised this. They had suspicions and felt that the system was not working correctly. The CEO knew about it, so this went on not because for lack of understanding, but instead the CEO refused to do anything about it. And it's not clear also that the corporate board of governors took it seriously or did anything about it as either. Now, eventually, now that this has come out, instead, realizing that this is actually a failure of the system rather than individual employees, they have had to pay huge damages on the order of over £1 billion in damages, replace the faulty system, and the reputational damage to the corporation has been significant. So why might this have happened? Well, we can only speculate, but probably the CEO was thinking in a narrow sense of, it will reflect badly on me in the short term during my tenure as CEO to call attention to the errors that are occurring. It also will be probably quite costly to try and solve this problem of actually having to replace our accountability systems. But of course, the irony is that now when these scandals unfold, they're even more costly when they are revealed, because the system ultimately has to be replaced. And now there's huge reputational, not to mention financial and legal damages, to say nothing of the effects on employees themselves who are wrongfully convicted. Another similar example we can think of is Boeing. And in recent years, so in 2018 and 2019, there were 2 crashes with Boeing 737s. They committed publicly that we are going to correct their kind of culture of safety and practices to ensure this doesn't happen. And then about exactly a year ago, a high-profile incident on Alaska Airlines where the door flew off. And once again, now this organization is seen as they publicly committed to doing something that they clearly have not followed through on, because likely this kind of short-term myopic, it'll be very costly to kind of correct these more structural cultural issues around how safety is managed. But then yet another scandal happens, and I believe that Boeing is now paid upwards of, I think they lost, their stock price went down 29% last year, $8 or $9 billion in damages. And again, huge reputational consequences where we see consumers, especially on lower budget airlines that use the 737, are no longer wanting to take those flights. So I think, again, this kind of misalignment between what organizations state they're going to do and then actually what they put into practice, that I think is often driven by this tension between short-term myopic perspectives versus kind of making decisions for long-term sustainable safety and ethical decision-making.
Thank you, Elinor. Just to confirm that Oliver has never worked in the UK Post Office.
But I have been. So in 2015, I was running DVLA, and we had Fujitsu running our IT systems, and we had at that time, I don't think it's contentious to say we had significant concerns, and the contract was coming to an end. And I took the decision to remove Fujitsu and end that contract exactly that time. And I think one of the issues around Post Office is that you have to ask the question at least once or twice as chief exec, as are you happy with the way things are done here? Are you content with this environment? And we weren't. My team wasn't. No one was happy with what was being delivered for us. And this was a massive, obviously very, very important system for the UK, as important actually as Horizon was. And we took that decision because we asked that question. And I think that's a perennial when it comes to ethical leadership. You have to be prepared to ask, are we actually happy with this?
Can I add something to that? So I'm so glad Oliver raised that point, because I think one of the things that leaders assume is that they underestimate how hard it is for people to speak up and to speak up when they have concerns. There's an assumption that, well, if people are not happy with something, I will know. And so they don't often always explicitly ask directly and solicit more critical responses. So there's both, I think, an assumption that it's easier to speak up than it actually is. And I think they also underestimate how threatening it feels to employees to bring up negative information. No one likes to be the bearer of bad news. And so even when the stakes are really high, people at times, if they look around and say, well, nobody else is kind of raising this, it's safer to just stay quiet. And so I think part of ethical leadership, a key part around communication is actively eliciting a diverse range of viewpoints, critical viewpoints, not just asking for things that are going to give you the answers you'd like to hear, and creating a broader culture of what we call in organizational behavior, psychological safety, where groups and teams feel that they're not going to be punished or negatively evaluated for raising questions, for bringing up information that's difficult to hear. So I think that's a really important piece of all this.
Elinor, I'm sure sure that Oliver and myself, both of us are experienced CEOs. We fully agree with you. This is a huge point that every CEO says, I welcome feedback, I welcome negative feedback, I welcome criticism, I welcome whistleblowers who identify potential problems. And we say that, but we need to deliver on that. We need to make sure that people who bring bad news are actually not punished, right? If you go back to Shakespeare, Claudius said to Polonius, I like you because you're a father of good news.
Exactly.
And we know where that brought Claudius, right? He underestimated many challenges to his rule, to put it mildly. And I would bring an ancient example of unethical leadership, which is Enron. Academics always talk about the research, and I've written a research paper about Enron. There, the culture was, we need to convince the market that we are doing well. And so they've created literally hundreds of SPVs, actually 3,000 of SPVs, including 900 offshore, just to obfuscate the real situation. And this culture was rewarded. The CFO was actually praised for this creative accounting work. And at some point, CEO and the board lost track of what's going on. They had no idea how actually profitable or unprofitable the business is. And the issue of whistleblowing was also front and center there when a vice president wrote a private message to a founder and president of the company. There was no follow-up, and eventually that resulted in a meltdown. And that was the most valuable energy company in the world at some point, a top 10 most valuable company in the United States. So inability to address this challenge that you said, which is directly related to ethical leadership, saying one thing and doing the other thing, is really, really important.
Yeah, if I can just to summarize, I feel like across these examples, again, there's this tension between often maximizing shareholder value and the stock price, especially with these large public companies where their financial mandate is we're meant to maximize shareholder value and keep the stock price high. The incentives and behaviors that to fulfill that objective can often run counter to others that we would say are around maximizing shareholder value, like Oliver referred to earlier, which is our employees, our business partners, trust from the broader kind of business community in our practices.
I mean, I quite often say, and I think this applies both in private and public sectors, the important thing for an organization, for a leader, is to say that you are externally confident, but internally never complacent. And I think a leader has to create space. It is sometimes difficult to not just want to hear good news all the time, but you have to be prepared on occasion to deal with the nagging thing that is in the back of your head and would have been in the back of everyone's head at Enron. You do have to address it, even if it is hard, because in the long term, if you don't, something will happen.
Absolutely. And as a CEO, I can confirm that when you open your inbox on whatever Teams or email program, I would say 90% messages are about problems. It's very rarely that I get a message, things are fine, our Fujitsu system is perfect, and you're a great leader. And that indeed creates this psychological challenge for any CEO. The guiding light of those ethical principles that we are talking about and the clarity of purpose that helps you to maintain mental balance. So ethical leadership is not just about organizational success, but also about mental equilibrium of the leader themselves. So let us unpack the issues that Elinor mentioned in the beginning, the features that constitute ethical leadership, such as accountability and inclusivity. So why we talk so much about diversity and inclusion when we talk about ethical leadership? Why it's not just a moral imperative, but also it is essential for better decision-making and organizational success, and how, in practical terms, we can integrate inclusivity in our workplace culture and business models. And what are the examples of successes and failures? I think in 2025, this is a very salient issue, especially in some countries. There is a major backlash against diversity and inclusion agenda. And proponents of inclusivity suggest that it's an essential part of ethical leadership. What is the link here? You started to talk about this in the beginning of the podcast. Can you unpack it for us, Elinor?
So I think in addition to the moral imperatives around diversity, there's also been a growing body of research over the last couple of decades that's looked at how diversity actually can contribute to more effective decision-making and innovation in organizations. And what that research has shown is that what we know is key to making effective decisions is that information needs to be analyzed critically. A range of perspectives ought to be brought to bear. We're not looking for just further confirmation of our intuitions, but actually being able to think skeptically and critically, and also a broad range of skills, expertise, and ways of thinking, which are key to creative problem solving and creativity, right? So as it turns out, when you have a more diverse team in terms of individuals from different backgrounds, different types of expertise, different even cultural perspectives, different connections, those are the conditions under which it's more likely that you're going to be able to have a broader range of knowledge, a broader range of skills that are going to go into the decisions that you make. So there's a content explanation, if you will. And there's also a process factor that's been identified as well, which is that when you have more diverse teams, precisely because there's an awareness that not everyone here comes from the same place, the same schools, is the same type of person, et cetera. There are fewer assumptions that are made, so things are often have to be made more explicit in terms of the information that's elicited and questions that are asked. So there's less heuristic, shortcut thinking and conversation, and that actual more slower, deliberative, and analytical process and solicitation of information actually means, again, that decisions often are made in a more effective way. And then relatedly, there's a whole research on creativity and innovation that also shows that groups tend to be more creative and innovative if they're able to kind of draw upon this broader range of expertise. So diversity, there's a lot of evidence can stand to help organizations make more effective decisions. However, the conditions have to be right under which the leaders elicit that information and that knowledge base.
Oliver, why for you would inclusivity, diversity be good for business, for the purpose of organization? Have you seen that in your experience? What would you suggest organizations do in those areas?
Definitely. I mean, I think there's a couple of things for me. The first is that the most important thing is that we reflect our customers and can understand our customers. And for a public sector organization, but also if you're a large corporate that has a wide customer base, it is really important that you're working hard to try and reflect that in your management team, so you have an understanding on the ground as to what your customer is looking for. It is, I will sit in a meeting and people will have very strong, but actually with our stakeholders too, very strong opinions on what people actually want, and they're wrong. I mean, I feel, viscerally that they haven't done the research. They have no experience, and I have to remind myself that I am often wrong as well. And I think that's useful in terms of understanding that diversity helps you be less wrong, because the default is you won't understand the majority of what your customers' experiences are. The decision-making point is also really quite a good one. I mean, it is one we continuously struggle on, but you're trying not to have everyone being the same. And that can create some challenges in building the team, although I think for the most part, my experience has been that the teams have been better and frankly more fun if you've got a more diverse range of people on your management team and in terms of your wider employees as well. But there are really strong reasons beyond the politics of it that make it really worthwhile having a diverse, different, inclusive workplace.
Yes, and this is what we also practice and preach at London Business School, because the challenges you are talking about are especially pertinent to global businesses, which have customers coming from different cultures and different backgrounds, and therefore the team itself, the organization itself, should include diverse views and perspectives in decision making. What Elinor has said directly refers to what you've said, Oliver, about fast and slow thinking, about heuristic-based and deliberation. This is what the famous psychologist who got a Nobel Prize in economics, Daniel Kahneman, calls fast and slow thinking. Fast thinking is system one thinking, if you like, when you have instinctive decision making. Deliberation is slower, and that brings you to better decisions. The problem with deliberation is if you talk to somebody like yourself, you may have the same heuristic, the same fast reactions, knee-jerk solutions to problems. And this is a diverse group's deliberation that can generate better decisions.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, one of the foundational studies, early studies on this, found that more diverse teams, they make better decisions, but they often feel the process was more challenging. So we can't rely on just intuitively what employees feel about how did that meeting go, because even sometimes the frictions or tensions of we're not all on the same page initially, or have different intuitions about kind of what the right way to handle this situation is, that actual very process of kind of airing a broader range of perspectives is integral to actually making a more effective decision. So sometimes there can be kind of the experience is a little more painful, but the outcome is ultimately better.
Absolutely. And since we talk about both private and public sector, I would mention that in policy making, this is a major challenge. And this is linked to the recent rise of populism, where people feel that decisions are made somewhere else by people who don't represent themselves, by people who went to elite schools, who don't have any understanding of the ordinary citizens, other customers, eventual customers' perspectives. And that creates a fertile ground for leaders who come and say, I will represent you. These elites are out of touch. I know how you live. Sometimes these concerns are well-grounded. Sometimes they are just perceptions. But this gap between decision makers and people who are supposed to represent, this is the issue of process, which may create backlash between decisions which were made quickly, but not necessarily representing the voters. And the word deliberation is key here, and many countries react to this challenge by using what's called deliberative democracy, citizens' assemblies, conventions, juries, and that works pretty well in some countries. Yeah.
Kahneman, actually, I was just remembering, has a wonderful phrase when he describes an organization as being a factory for decisions. And it feels somewhat that, and I think this is what people generally feel, is that the factory is kind of broken when it comes to the decision-making process for public policy. It's not creating any kind of speed of decision making. It's not really evidence based. It is creating problems across the board. I think that's partly because just the scale of the challenges that people have at the moment are so very, very significant. But you would have to say that having more diversity in that process is going to help, even if, generally it makes people feel as a whole disenfranchised at the moment, just because the scale of the challenges is so significant.
Yes, we are in a country which is a democracy and one of the oldest countries extending the franchise, talking about Magna Carta. This process of involving more people in decision-making, though not necessarily everybody at once, almost 1,000 years ago. But still, I would say that that's the whole idea of democracy, that everybody has a stake, everybody has a voice. Sometimes non-democratic regimes are proud of taking quick decisions, not going through complicated process of elaborating policy solutions. But eventually, this is an economic fact that on average, democracies grow faster. We just had a Nobel Prize awarded to Daron Acemoglu, whose recent paper says democracy does cause growth. And the argument is exactly this. You involve people in elaborating better decisions, not just at the level of an organization, but at the level of national economy as well.
If I can also add, I think another key aspect of this that I want to highlight is the role of transparency as well too. So in addition to involving people, feeling a broader range of people are involved in the decision-making process, what is equally important is that there's a sense of transparency around what our process for making the decision is, and communicating when there is a decision, not just this is the decision that we're making, but this is the reason why we came to that decision. And transparency is so foundational for building trust. It also is yet another mechanism where if you've committed to being transparent to your stakeholders, to your employees about the decisions you're making and the logic behind them, it also as a leader holds you accountable for thinking through more carefully the logic behind the decision that you've come to. And I think raising the political, the rise of populism that we're seeing, we can think of a lot of examples of where a lot of this distrust and reactance is coming from a place of feeling like not only do the leaders not represent me, there's also a lack of transparency and honesty about why decisions are being made as they are.
So we mentioned that ethical leadership inspires trust, instills trust. And this is one of the major objectives, if you like, in practical terms of ethical leadership. What do we actually mean in practical terms? How does that work? Where does the trust emerge from? How does that contribute to better performance?
So we can think about the importance of trust and ethical leadership in a few different ways. One, the trust that employees or other stakeholders have in the leader or the organization, which is important for both at the employee level, motivation. So a sense of if I believe that my leader is someone I can rely on and that they're actually going to follow through on what they say they're going to do, that increases employee motivation, less likely to leave the organization. And for more external stakeholders, trust helps build long-term loyalty and partnership. So that can help the business from a performance level. We know that several organizations, for example, Starbucks is one, they have been really committed to ensuring that they pay fair wages and fair business practices for all of the farmers that they work with. So this helps them maintain really loyal suppliers, which can help facilitate their success. And trust also is really key for many of the communication dynamics and psychological safety that we were speaking about before. And so it's really foundational for employees being willing to, as we said, speak up when they have ideas, which is going to be key to creative problem solving and decision making, speaking up when they see something wrong in the organization so that those potential problems that can result in disastrous consequences get addressed early enough. And so I think in a myriad of ways for the long-term sustainability of the organization and for a culture that is going to ensure that open information is exchanged and things that need to be raised are raised and decisions are made from a truly the most thoughtful way possible, trust is essential.
Oliver?
I think it's very difficult as a leader to tell whether you're trusted or not. It would be impossible for me to say, everyone trusts me. I think I try to do three things effectively. I try to be consistent. So as long as I'm not chopping and changing, and people know that when I say something that I do mean it, that seems to be a start. I think the second thing that I will do is, again, try and admit mistakes. So also say, okay, I was consistently wrong before, and now I'm prepared to change. I want to hear a different opinion. I want to see what I've been doing wrong and move forward, whether that's a business decision or a behavioral thing or whatever. And I think the third thing, which I think can be a struggle for today's CEO, is I try to be basically having the same experience as everyone who works for me and everyone on my team. So they shouldn't feel that their CEO is an unworldly elite. And that can be, I think, a challenge for quite a lot of CEOs today.
That's true. Let me play a devil's advocate and ask you a question about trust in our new era of digital technology, surveillance, and AI. A lot of people would say that today trust may be overrated because the benefit of trust is indeed to save on legal contracts, on the need to monitor and link performance to quantitative indicators that you now can easily collect. So in today's environment, monitoring employee performance and also writing long legal contracts is becoming cheaper and cheaper. ChatGPT can replace many expensive lawyers for you, if you like. To what extent do you think this is actually true with the new digital technology and AI? Trust is overrated.
So I certainly don't think that trust is overrated in the new digital environment that we're in. I think if anything, it's all the more important given that with social media, the rise of misinformation, disinformation, and access to now kind of increasingly algorithmic-driven decision-making, I think the personal human connections and trust that can really only be formed in a sustained way through person-to-person contact is all the more important. So given how hard it is to verify, or increasingly hard to verify, that if you get an email from someone, that was something that they wrote themselves versus ChatGPT wrote. Actually, I think we might see increasingly face-to-face meetings and more ironically somewhat kind of analog old school ways of interacting are increasingly valued and prioritized because those cues you get from in person of looking someone in the eye, asking questions, information exchange, disclosing of yourself and the other person, those are what actually form trust at a much deeper level that is going to make people be willing to and want to work for you in the long term. So I actually think like I said, ironically, we may kind of go back to more old school traditional forms of trust, given how hard it is to kind of verify so much of our mediated communications.
Oliver?
Totally agree. I mean, as the value of social interactions is just being commoditized to almost nothing, real social human interaction becomes more and more valuable, and trust is really the driver of that value.
And as we think about our role in business school education in terms of what we need to be educating for, I think that these more interpersonal skills, communication skills, what are sometimes called softer skills that people aren't always thinking first and foremost about why they're coming to business school, I think are going to be increasingly important and necessary to do well as a way of differentiating yourself, both because so much of this quantitative skill can be accessible through generative AI, et cetera, but also the skills of building of teams that are going to have the kind of cultures that are more sustainable and productive is really increasingly going to require people to be attuned to these more interpersonal communication dynamics and building more inclusive teams and organizations. So I expect those kind of softer interpersonal skills to become more and more of a differentiator.
Let me ask a question which we actually ask in every episode. Thinking ahead, what's one actionable step that individuals or organizations can take today to advance ethical leadership and drive meaningful progress?
So I think one actionable step that organizations can take is to be proactive about setting a value that they want to guide their decisions, and then look at their actual incentive systems within their team or organization to see to what extent do what's rewarded or incentivized in the organization actually align with those values.
Oliver?
I think an important part when it comes to inclusion is that you hire people who are different from you. And all other things being equal, if you can, that for me would be a great thing to do.
Thank you very much. And now we'd love to hear from you, our audience. Do you have examples of leaders who have driven meaningful change by embedding ethical and moral practices into their organizations? Share your perspectives by leaving a comment on Spotify, YouTube, or LinkedIn. And don't forget to include the hashtag ThinkAhead in one word. think ahead. Be sure to follow and subscribe so you'll stay informed and never miss an episode. And look out for updates on upcoming Think Ahead events. Visit london.edu/think. london.edu/think. This podcast is part of the Second 60, London Business School's 60th anniversary initiative, where we're discussing 6 global challenges that are shaping the future of global business. Thank you very much, Oliver and Elinor, for this fascinating conversation. And thank you to all of you, our listeners, for joining us today.